Watching Gravitas. In 2011, China made headlines when Beijing became a gas chamber. Choking smog hung over the country's north for days. A situation many described as an apocalypse. 6 years on, while citizens still endure smog in China, the country wants to be the international leader on climate change. In a call to newly elected French President Emmanuel Macron, China's Xi Jinping has vowed to protect the Paris Accord. Beijing hopes to negate the effects of US President Trump's skepticism about the pact. Trump is mulling a withdrawal. Earlier, he promised to cancel the climate deal, which has been signed by 196 countries. While China sees it as a chance to boost its international standing, its record on climate change leaves much to be desired. It is the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter since the year 2006. China is building $500 million worth of coal plants, and coal power generation capacity is expected to grow by 19% in 5 years alone, burning 17% more coal per year than the data earlier disclosed revealed, and 900 coal mines will boost production by 1 million tons per day as directed by the government in China. Beijing has also promised to cut emissions by 40 to 45% and increase reliance on non-fossil energy sources by 20%. But these are still tall promises, not much achieved on this front. Chinese companies, though, continue to finance coal plants overseas. And so the record comes into question. While China is trying to assume leadership on this front, is it also confronting these problems, or is this just hypocrisy? That is the question we're asking on Gravitas. With us, Ainar Thangan, political and economic commentator, joining us from Beijing. Also, Sonali Chitre, environmental and energy lawyer in New York. Good evening. Good to have both of you on the show. Ainar, does China see Trump's position as an opportunity?
I don't think it's a situation where the world is warming, and it has paid the price of its early economic development, as is India. India has 8 of the top 10 most polluted cities, is in fact a signatory to the Paris Accord, and is also behind this. It's also one of the leading emitters of carbon emissions, and also is taking this very seriously. So I don't think this is something where somebody wins and somebody loses. It's a question of we either act together or we will hang separately.
Well, it's interesting that you bring India into the equation. We weren't talking about India. We were talking about Donald Trump opposing the deal and China saying that we will lead it from the front. But nonetheless, let me put this question to Sonali Chitre then. Sonali, can China assume a leadership position on an issue like this without setting its own house in order?
Well, to be very honest with you, I do know that China is investing at least $400 billion in green technology, and they're profiting a lot from solar. They're, in fact, leading manufacturers of solar panels in the world. And I will tell you this. The United States, I really do not believe is going to pull out of the Paris Agreement. I was protesting in front of the White House on April 29th as part of the People's Climate March. Leonardo DiCaprio and Al Gore led the march. And there are many, many environmentalists who are actually very, very strongly pushing toward greater targets than even what the nationally determined contributions, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals, actually kind of require. So as one example, a good friend of mine is a sustainability director for the city of Atlanta. Atlanta, Georgia has promised to be completely renewable by 2035. So there are many, many leaders in cities, states, also in the private sector and in the philanthropic sector here in the U.S. The U.S. is not going anywhere. I do believe that we're the world leaders. And I look to India actually and China to be world leaders as well. I mean, there's no race to the bottom here. It's always a race to the top.
Ainar, the intention is well taken, but is Beijing also concentrating on what's being done at home, how Chinese companies are investing in all these coal mines, and that is something that is not being reined in?
Oh, quite the opposite, actually. China is one of the few countries that will actually take criminal action against those officials and companies who violate these things. You will notice in the first half of this year and in last year, the number of fines handed out have been at a record level. So I don't know exactly where you're getting this information, that China is lagging behind. It is actually ahead of the targets that the or set at the Paris Climate Accord, and has been pointed out by my colleague in New York, is spending an enormous amount of money. Now, I'm not trying to compare that with India. You just said that and mentioned that hypocrisy is an issue. And the question is not what the U.S. is doing, but what each individual country can do to make sure that this is not an issue for the future.
Right. India's position, of course, is very clear. It's a developing country and, well, the biggest polluters need to do the most. But I'll tell you where I'm getting these figures from. Reports saying that the government has allowed 900 coal mines to boost production by 1 million tons per day in China.
Okay, I don't know where you attribute it to. But I know that the amount of coal production has actually gone down, that they're closing a lot of mines, especially those that produce the lower quality steam coal, and are trying to switch to higher quality. In terms of these numbers that you mentioned, 20% renewable and nuclear, they are well on their way. China is the leading manufacturer of nuclear facilities. It's not only trying to do those in China, where it has over 90% of the new reactors being put in the world in China. It is also trying to export this technology around the world.
Sonali, what about the U.S.? A White House meeting to discuss this topic on Tuesday was postponed. Reports say that there are divisions within senior Trump advisors. And it's the second time I understand a meeting like this has been postponed. So where does America stand? Is Trump even open to suggestions other than what he's been saying?
Well, to be very honest with you, I mean, I think that Trump is now giving most of his climate regulatory power to his daughter, Ivanka Trump, who, along with her husband, Jared Kushner, are very supportive of keeping the U.S. in the Paris Agreement because they see the economic benefits as well as the benefits for children and families, the next generation. And that's what this is all about, intergenerational equity. So luckily, I do think that the U.S. is going to be staying in the Paris Agreement. And I also think that, you know, quite frankly, like I said, that this is not just about a competition within U.S., China, and India. It's really about them collaborating. And world leaders, including Frank Bainimarama, who is the Prime Minister of Fiji, who will be leading COP23 in Bonn, Germany in November, he has personally reached out to Trump, as well as many others that have reached out to Trump, saying we need to stay in this agreement. It took almost 200 countries 20 years to get to this point. You know, failure is not an option. There is no planet B. We've got to live within our planetary boundaries. We've got to help those women, children, minorities, indigenous people living in the areas that are being affected first and worst. And even here in New York City, I mean, Hurricane Sandy was worsened by climate change. So Trump is very conscious of this. He's not going anywhere. I assure India, and I beg, you know, India, please do not pull out of the Paris Agreement. We are going to be working on this together as a globe.
Well, India isn't pulling out, but thanks very much. Sonali Chhitre, Ainar Tangan, appreciate as always both of you joining us here on the show. And the American president, we know, has a flair for drama and brashness, and the FBI chief learned it the hard way. James Comey was fired, and he heard it first on TV. While pundits are betting on his successor, critics say this is bigger than Watergate.
You're fired. You're fired. You're fired. You're fired. You're fired.
He made a career out of firing people, and Donald Trump hasn't stopped. His latest victim is this man. FBI Chief James Comey was addressing agents in Los Angeles when TV reports said he'd been sacked. He reportedly laughed and thought it was a prank. But soon the White House confirmed it, quoting the Deputy Attorney General.
He's very familiar with the Department of Justice, obviously the FBI, and he made a decision, clearly, based on the letter that he submitted, that the FBI director lost his confidence.
Sure enough, the sacking of America's top law enforcement official, only the second time in the country's history, sparked a political storm.
This is part of a deeply troubling pattern from the Trump administration. They fired Sally Yates. They fired Preet Bharara. And now they fired Director Comey, the very man leading the investigation. This does not seem to be a coincidence.
The Democrats want a special prosecutor to be appointed to oversee the probe into Russian links with the Trump campaign. The sacking raises concerns about the FBI's independence in the investigation. It comes a day after a grand jury started issuing subpoenas or summons to associates of former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. If confirmed, this would mean the investigation has entered a decisive phase and Trump is feeling the heat.
Honestly, like when you do stuff like that, it's always something to hide. Like, I feel like government period is something to hide, but with this whole Trump situation, you notice they always try to throw something else in the media, like to pull us away from what's really going on with that.
But the president insists his decision was prompted by Comey's inept handling of the Hillary Clinton email investigation. Comey recently testified about Clinton's use of a private email server as Secretary of State and the FBI's probe into Russian meddling in the presidential election.
Do you stand by your testimony that there is an active investigation, counterintelligence investigation regarding Trump campaign individuals in the Russian government as to whether or not they collaborate? You said that in March. Is
to
that
see if there was any coordination between the Russian effort and people's...
Is that still going on?
Yes.
Okay, so nothing's changed. You stand by those two statements?
Correct.
As critics label Trump's actions Nixonian, his office says the search for a successor is already on. Bureau Report, WION. Joining us on the show, Stephen Golub, political and international affairs expert, joining us from California. Good evening, Stephen. Good to have you on the show. Is this Nixonian? Does the sacking put a question mark on the FBI's independence on this probe?
That's really an understatement. This could be worse than Nixonian. This could be worse than Watergate, as strong as that statement is. The reason is that this gets at the very foundations of our democracy. We have a Russian interference with U.S. elections last year. That's pretty much undisputed. What's being investigated is Trump officials, or perhaps Donald Trump himself, colluding, cooperating with that interference. And by firing the man who was in charge of the investigation, Trump is raising issues, challenges to our very rule of law and our democracy. That's why I say this really could be bigger than Watergate.
And how much trouble is Donald Trump right now in? Has this investigation really reached his doorstep?
That's harder to say. The investigation in some ways may really just be in its early stages. They're just beginning to interview some people who might be useful, to issue various types of orders or requests for people to provide information to testify. This could be going on for months or months, but I'd say the very fact that Trump saw fit to fire Comey is an indication that it may be, or that he fears that it will reach his doorstep, and that he may well have something to hide. I don't want to conclude that absolutely, but his firing Comey, if he didn't have anything to worry about, then why fire Comey?
Right, and this is also a man who doesn't have many political friends, I understand, from the Hillary Clinton investigation to now this. So the former FBI chief is in a tough spot. Reports also now saying that the Senate intelligence told Comey to speed up this investigation on Monday, and it is too much of a coincidence that on Tuesday he was fired.
Well, that's an interesting development. It's true that Comey was inept in handling at least the public communications about the Clinton investigation. He should not have come up and made a public statement months in advance with his own judgment of whether Hillary had done anything wrong. He should not have interfered, in effect, with the U.S. election just a week before the election took place. Having said that, in defense of Comey, he really is not considered, even though he's considered inept as to how he's handled this, he's not considered partisan, he's not considered corrupt or biased, and that's why, even though some people may feel, yes, Comey in a sense had this come to him for how poorly he handled the Clinton investigation, they still would have preferred for his being in charge of the investigation of the Russian connection with the Trump campaign, or at least with the Russian connection with interfering with U.S. elections.
And my final question, does someone like Comey have any recourse? We know that there is a lot of political anger and people are attaching motives to it. But beyond that, can someone force the White House to rethink this decision? Does he have legal recourse?
Oh, that's a question, and the short answer is no. It is the president's decision whether to fire the FBI director. Now, Comey could go ahead and make some statements that cast doubt on Trump's motives, but beyond, and that in and of itself may be damaging to Trump. But as a legal matter, no, he's gone, he's fired, his job is over.
All right, we leave it at that. Stephen Golub, thanks very much for putting this entire matter in perspective for our viewers here on WION. Appreciate you joining us. And with that, it's a wrap on the show. We're out of time. Thanks very much for watching.